She went to a place where there were no roads or neighbors. A small house on stilts in the middle of a quiet lake seemed like the perfect hideaway. But every time she returned, strange things would go missing until she found out who was hiding nearby and what the water was really hiding. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The road that led to the lake was little more than a ribbon of gravel, curling through the Oregon woods where moss clung to the trunks like wet velvet. Maggie Hart drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the edge of the window as she inhaled the smell of pine and damp earth. The air felt untouched here, thick, almost heavy with the scent of rain and something ancient. It had been 6 hours since she'd left Portland behind, 6 hours since she had watched the last stretch of highway disappear in the rearview mirror. What waited for her now was silence. Dense, unbroken, the kind that didn't need permission to fill every space. The cabin appeared at the bend of the path, like something grown from the lake itself. It stood on wooden stilts, its reflection shimmering in the still water. The roof was alive with moss, the boards uneven, weathered by years of storms and winters. From the shore, a narrow wooden walkway reached toward it, each plank creaking softly, as if remembering the footsteps of those who'd come before. Maggie parked the truck, killed the engine, and sat for a long moment with her fingers still wrapped around the key. This was what she had chosen, a place too quiet for regret, too far for gossip to follow. When she finally stepped out, her boots sank slightly into the wet ground. The air was cooler here, the lake breathing faintly beneath a skin of morning mist. Somewhere in the distance, a heron lifted from the reeds, its wings cutting through the air with a sound that was both sharp and soothing. Maggie stood on the dock, the boards moaning under her weight, and looked at the cabin, her new home. She had seen the photographs online, of course, but they hadn't captured the way the water mirrored the world or how the wind seemed to whisper against the walls. She walked the length of the bridge slowly, pausing halfway to test the lever that lifted the last section of the walkway. It rose stiffly, creaking in protest, until the planks formed a makeshift gate. It wasn't much, but it gave her a strange sense of safety. In a life where she had lost control of almost everything, a wooden bridge that obeyed her hand felt like power. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and dust. The single room was small but bright, with sunlight spilling through a tiny window. The furniture was minimal: a narrow bed, a wooden table, and 2 chairs that didn't match. In the corner sat a rusted kettle, a pile of firewood, and a small stove that looked like it had seen better decades. She placed her box of supplies on the table and unpacked her life one item at a time: a notebook, a thermos, a tin of coffee, and a microscope carefully wrapped in cloth. The microscope was old, almost antique, but it had followed her through every stage of her career. It was the one object that still felt like hers. Maggie's work had once been her language. In the city, she had spent years inside white laboratories, her eyes pressed to glass slides, while the hum of machines filled the air. She had believed in science the way some people believed in prayer. But faith, she learned, could be a fragile thing. When she discovered the falsified reports, the numbers that didn't match, the toxic levels hidden beneath corporate smiles, she had tried to speak, and when she spoke, they silenced her. Unstable, one of them had said in a meeting she hadn't been invited to attend. Emotionally compromised. That phrase had followed her through every rejection letter after.
She had told herself that coming here was about peace, about solitude, but she knew better. The truth was simpler, uglier. She had run. Run from the faces that avoided her in the grocery store, from the colleagues who had stopped answering her calls, from the version of herself who used to believe that the truth was enough. Now, surrounded by trees and water, She wanted to disappear into something that didn't require explanation. She spent her first evening cleaning. The cabin came alive under her touch, the table wiped free of dust, the windows cleared of grime. She boiled water on the stove, watching the kettle shudder as it whistled, and poured herself tea that tasted faintly of rust. As dusk settled, the world outside dissolved into shades of silver. Frogs croaked somewhere beneath the stilts, and the water lapped quietly against the posts. She sat on the porch with her tea, her reflection trembling beneath her feet, and for a moment, the silence was kind. That night, she dreamt of water. Not this calm, glassy lake, but a darker one, the kind that carried secrets beneath its surface. She woke just before dawn, her heartbeat quick and unsteady, the air heavy with fog. A thin mist drifted through the gaps in the boards, and outside, the world seemed erased. Her days began to settle into a pattern. She rose early, boiled coffee, and sat at the edge of the deck, writing in her notebook. The handwriting was small and precise, the way she used to record data in the lab. Water temperature, 12 papo. Odor, neutral. Clarity, moderate. At first it was habit, a scientist's attempt to give order to solitude. But slowly, the entries grew more personal. The air feels thicker today. The wind smells of pine resin. I think I'm beginning to breathe again. By the third week, she had mapped every inch of the small lake. She collected samples, labeled them carefully, and stored them in glass jars near the window. It wasn't work. Not really. No one was paying her anymore. But it gave her a reason to wake up. Sometimes she imagined sending the results somewhere, publishing them anonymously. Other times, she closed the notebook and told herself to forget. In the evenings, she watched the forest. It changed with the light gold at sunset, black at night, green like a pulse at dawn. There were sounds, too. The crack of branches, the flutter of unseen wings, the ripple of water when fish surfaced to breathe. Yet sometimes, beneath all that natural rhythm, there was something else. A faint disturbance, like a step too soft to be animal. The first time she noticed something missing, she didn't think much of it. A can of soup, maybe she had eaten it already. But when the flashlight vanished, she frowned. 2 days later, her compass was gone too. She searched the cabin, then the bridge, even the small toolbox under the bed. But there was nothing. It wasn't the objects themselves that bothered her. It was the pattern. Things disappeared only when she left the lake for town. She told herself it must be raccoons. The locals had warned her about them, clever creatures with hands almost human. She started storing food in sealed boxes, sweeping the floor for crumbs. Still, the disappearances continued. One morning, she found muddy prints on the deck, smaller than an adult's, but larger than a raccoon's paw. 5 toes, a barefoot human print. The sight unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She crouched beside it, tracing the edges with her fingertip. The footprint led from the dock to the cabin door, and there, on the windowsill, lay a scrap of paper torn from a notebook. On it, drawn in clumsy pencil lines, was a picture of the lake, the sun, and a tiny figure standing beside a house on stilts. Beneath it, in crooked letters, someone had written, "Water Lady." Maggie stared at it for a long time. She couldn't decide whether to laugh or to feel afraid. The drawing was innocent, almost sweet, but the idea of someone watching her was not. She scanned the tree line across the lake, but there was nothing except a wall of green. Still, she could not shake the feeling that the forest was looking back. That night, she lifted the bridge. The mechanism was rough, the rope frayed, but the planks rose slowly until the connection between her world and the shore was broken. She stood there, one hand on the lever, watching as the last sliver of wood locked into place.
The silence that followed was absolute. It should have made her feel safe. Instead, it made her feel trapped. She lit the lamp and sat at her table, trying to read. The flame flickered as though uncertain of its own strength. Outside, the forest whispered. Now and then, she thought she heard a splash. A laugh carried softly over the water. Once, she thought she saw movement near the edge of the trees, a small flash of color, like a child's jacket. But when she blinked, it was gone. The days grew shorter, the light dimmer. The forest turned to amber and rust, and the air smelled of rain. Maggie kept her bridge raised more often now. Each morning she lowered it only long enough to fetch water or supplies, then pulled it back up again. It became ritual, a way of controlling the edges of her loneliness. She wrote in her notebook, "It's strange how isolation can feel both like punishment and protection." But one morning, while she was taking notes by the deck, a movement in the corner of her eye made her freeze. Near the far end of the lake, just where the trees bent low, two figures stood small, still, and watching. One taller, one shorter. When she lifted her hand to shield her eyes from the glare, they vanished into the forest. The prints appeared again that evening, fresh on the damp wood. 2 sets this time, side by side. Maggie followed them halfway across the bridge before they disappeared into the air, as though the owners had known exactly where the boards began to creak. She stood there, listening, and for the first time since coming to the lake, she felt the unmistakable sense of being seen. When night fell, she sat alone by the window, the lamp turned low. The drawing still lay on the table, the words, "Water Lady," catching the light. The forest beyond the glass was nothing but shadow, but in her chest, a quiet unease had begun to stir. Something like fear, and something like curiosity. She thought of the small footprints, of the laughter she thought she'd heard, of the empty cans, and the missing light. Whoever was out there knew her now. Maggie took a deep breath, closed her notebook, and whispered into the silence, as though to the lake itself. "I'm not alone here, am I?" The water didn't answer, but it rippled once, faintly, as if something beneath its surface had turned over in sleep. And for the first time, Maggie Hart began to wonder if her refuge was watching her too. The morning after the mist thickened on the water, Maggie woke with the faintest sense that something inside the cabin had shifted. She couldn't explain it, but the air felt different, heavier, somehow occupied. The sunlight filtering through the small window seemed less golden than usual, as if the forest had leaned closer during the night and was peering inside. She rose quietly and walked to the deck, the wood cold under her bare feet. The lake was perfectly still, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the slow drift of the clouds. For a moment, everything looked unchanged, yet she knew, deep down, it wasn't. On the table lay her notes from the previous evening. A half-filled jar of lake water glimmered faintly beside them. She reached for her pen and noticed the cap was missing. It wasn't the kind of detail most people would notice, but Maggie's mind had become meticulous through years of lab work. A missing pen cap meant someone or something had touched what was hers. She turned, scanning the floor. Near the corner, just beyond the stove, a faint smudge of mud curved like a toe print. Then another, smaller. Her pulse quickened. She opened the door, stepping out into the fog, her eyes tracing the bridge. The planks were damp from the night's rain. At the far end, just before the lever that lifted the final section, she saw them clearly this time. 2 sets of prints, one larger, one smaller, the edges softened by moisture. The tracks ended abruptly where the wood met the grass. Whoever had come across had returned to the forest before dawn. Maggie's throat tightened. The laughter she thought she had imagined last night no longer felt like a dream. For the rest of the day, she couldn't focus. She tried to read, to write, to analyze samples of algae, but her attention drifted to every small sound: the creak of the stilts beneath the house, the tapping of branches against the window, the hollow knock of something bumping against the posts under the water. When evening came, she left her lamp unlit. Instead, she sat in the dark, watching the trees beyond the bridge as shadows deepened. The silence was thick enough to touch. Then, just as she was about to rise, she saw it. A faint glow moving between the trunks. It flickered like a lantern, swaying gently, then stopped. Her heart pounded. Someone was out there, watching again. The light moved closer, step by slow step, until it reached the far edge of the bridge. Two figures appeared, small silhouettes against the silvered water. Maggie froze, holding her breath. The taller one seemed to whisper to the smaller, then both crouched. She heard the faint squeak of a loose plank. Without thinking, she lit her lantern and opened the door. "Who's there?" Her voice broke the night like a pebble thrown into glass. The taller figure stood up quickly. The smaller let out a small gasp. They turned to flee, but Maggie, reacting from instinct more than thought, called out again, this time softer. "Wait. Don't run." The words hung in the fog, unsure whether they were invitation or plea. The figures hesitated. Maggie stepped forward, the lantern light spreading across the bridge. She saw them clearly now. A boy, maybe 13, thin and pale beneath the dirt, and a little girl clinging to his arm, no older than 9, both barefoot, both trembling. The boy's eyes darted between Maggie and the water, weighing escape. The girl's face was streaked with mud, her hair tangled like roots. "Please," Maggie said, her voice low, steady. "You don't need to be afraid." The boy swallowed hard, his jaw set with that fragile kind of defiance children wear when the world has already been cruel to them. "We didn't mean nothing," he said finally. His accent was local, his voice hoarse. "We were just looking." Maggie took a step closer, and he flinched. The girl tugged his sleeve and whispered something that sounded like, "It's her, the lady from the lake." Maggie blinked. "The lady from the lake?" The boy shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Ellie says you talk to the water," he muttered. "She says you live on it, 'cause you're not scared of it." The girl, Ellie, peeked from behind her brother's shoulder, eyes wide. "Do you?" she asked softly. Maggie felt something shift inside her, an old tenderness she thought she'd buried with her past. "Sometimes," she said. "But mostly, I just listen." The boy's stance eased, his shoulders lowering an inch. Maggie noticed the hollows beneath his cheekbones. The dirt ground into his hands. "What are your names?" she asked. "I'm Maggie." The boy hesitated before answering. "Lucas," he said at last. "And this is Ellie. We live over there." He pointed vaguely toward the forest, where no house could be seen. "With our granddad." "Does your granddad know you're here?" Maggie asked gently. Lucas's eyes hardened. "He don't care," he said. "He's sick most days. Sleeps all the time." Ellie's lip trembled. "We just wanted to see," she whispered. Maggie's throat tightened as she looked at them, two small bodies standing in the fog, shivering from cold and fear. Whatever anger she'd carried about the missing food or footprints dissolved. She could see the truth written in their thin arms and wary eyes. Hunger, loneliness, the raw instinct to survive. "Come inside," she said softly. "You look frozen." Lucas shook his head. "We can't. He'll be mad if we're gone too long." But even as he said it, his gaze flickered toward the cabin, where warm light spilled through the open door. Maggie turned without another word. walked in, and set 2 mugs of warm water on the table. "You don't have to stay," she said over her shoulder, "but you can drink before you go." She heard the boards creak behind her. When she looked back, they were there, hesitant, cautious, but inside. Ellie went straight to the table, wrapping her fingers around the mug as if afraid it might vanish. Lucas lingered near the door. Maggie took a loaf of bread from the counter and sliced it quietly. "You've been taking food from here," she said, not as accusation but as fact. The boy's chin lifted. "We were hungry." "I know," she replied simply. "You could have asked." He frowned. "People don't help," he said flatly. "Not where we're from." Maggie wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in her throat. She remembered boardrooms where people smiled while burying the truth, laboratories full of silence when she'd spoken. Maybe he wasn't wrong at all. "You can come during the day," she said finally, "if you need food, but not at night. It's dangerous crossing the bridge in the dark." Ellie looked up, her eyes bright. "Can we really?" Maggie nodded. Yes. That night, after they'd gone, she sat long after the lamp burned low, staring at the ripples their footsteps had left on the damp planks. The cabin felt different now, less like an island and more like a doorway. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what she had invited in. Over the next days, the rhythm of her life changed quietly, almost without her realizing. The children returned in daylight, first timidly, then with growing familiarity. Lucas helped mend the torn mesh she used to filter algae. Ellie swept the porch, humming tunelessly. Maggie found herself teaching again, explaining how to test water clarity with a stick and string, how to count dragonflies to guess the oxygen level of a pond. The lessons felt small, unimportant, yet they stitched something back together inside her. Ellie drew constantly. She filled pages from Maggie's old field notebook with pictures of fish, birds, and frogs, labeling each with phonetic guesses of their names. Lucas, quieter, watched the water with a scientist's patience. He was quick to notice things, the change in the wind before rain, the way certain reeds bent toward the current. One afternoon, as they collected samples near the edge of the lake, he asked, "Why do you do this, if no one pays you?" Maggie smiled faintly. "Because the water remembers everything. I just like to listen to what it says." He didn't answer, but later she found him dipping his fingers into the shallows, staring as if trying to hear it too. For the first time since arriving, Maggie felt the days stretch warmly around her. The loneliness that had clung to her like a second skin began to thin. She wrote in her notebook again, though the entries were different now. Not sterile observations, but fragments of life. Lucas built a bird feeder today. Ellie found a blue feather. The lake smells cleaner this morning. Maybe it's just me. But the illusion of peace never lasts long in places that hold secrets. It was late one evening when she first noticed the smell. Faint, metallic, unpleasant. At first she thought it came from the old stove, but the odor grew stronger near the window. It reminded her of lab samples gone wrong, of solvents and oil and chemical residue. The next morning she tested the water out of habit. The pH was lower than before, the color darker. Curious, she collected more samples from various points around the lake. By sunset, her unease had hardened into dread. Under the microscope, the truth was unmistakable. Tiny particles shimmered in the water, unnatural, glinting like shards of silver. The chemical traces matched a pattern she knew too well. Industrial runoff, heavy metals, compounds that shouldn't exist in any ecosystem untouched by factories. Her hands trembled as she took notes. This lake, her refuge, was sick. She checked the data twice, 3 times, hoping she was wrong. But she wasn't. The contamination was spreading fast. For a long time she sat motionless, staring at the jars lined along the window. Each one looked clear, harmless, but she could see death blooming inside. Memories surged, the company badge she'd turned in, the reports she'd written that had been buried, the colleagues who had turned their faces away. It wasn't over. Somehow, it had followed her here. When Lucas and Ellie arrived the next morning, she tried to act normal. They laughed as they told her about their grandfather's stories of the forest spirits, and she smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. That night she stayed awake, rechecking her samples under candlelight. The numbers didn't lie. The same company, Norchem Industries, was responsible. They had been dumping waste into the rivers again, and this lake was part of the same watershed she'd once tried to protect. The realization left her cold. All this time she had believed she'd escaped, but she had only circled back to the heart of the rot. She thought about leaving, but the thought of abandoning the children and the water felt like betrayal. When Lucas asked the next day why she seemed sad, she told him a version of the truth. "Someone is hurting the lake," she said, "and I don't know how to stop them yet." Ellie's eyes widened. "Can you fix it?" "I can try," Maggie said, "but it's dangerous." Lucas looked at her for a long moment. "You used to work for them, didn't you?" he said quietly. She blinked, startled. "How do you know that?" "I found a paper in the notebook you left open," he admitted. "It had their name on it. I remember seeing trucks like that by the highway." Maggie felt the weight of his gaze, steady and fearless. "Yes," she said finally. "I used to work for them, and I tried to stop them once." "Then maybe it's time you try again," he said. His words lingered long after they had gone home. That night, as wind swept across the lake, she stood by the lever of her bridge and hesitated. For weeks, she had raised it to keep the world out, to preserve her peace. Now she wondered if it was time to lower it and let the world in. The water below was dark, the air filled with the scent of rain and pine. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. Maggie stared into the reflection of her lamp, trembling on the lake's surface like a second moon, and whispered, "All right then. We start tomorrow." The bridge stayed down, and as dawn crept across the sky, the first light of morning turned the lake into a mirror that no longer seemed to hide what lay beneath. The storm began before dawn, sweeping across the forest like an old anger revived. Rain lashed the windows of the cabin, and the surface of the lake churned, each wave breaking against the stilts beneath Maggie's floorboards. She woke to the sound of thunder rolling low across the hills, the kind of sound that vibrated inside the ribs. The air smelled of wet earth and something sharp metallic, faintly chemical. She lit the lantern, its weak glow trembling across the walls, and for a long moment, she simply listened. Somewhere beneath the wind's roar, she thought she heard another noise, mechanical and steady, like the hum of an engine far away. She stepped onto the porch and looked out. Through the sheets of rain, she saw 2 points of light moving along the opposite shore headlights. Maybe, though there was no road there. By morning, the rain had slowed, leaving behind a cold mist that clung to everything. The forest steamed, the water calmed, and the world looked scrubbed clean, but unsettled. Maggie boiled coffee and sat by the table, her notebook open. The results from her last tests spread across the page. The contamination levels had risen overnight. Whatever was poisoning the lake was getting worse, not better. She traced her finger along the margin of the page where she had written the name Norchem Industries. The letters looked like scars. She had come here to disappear, but the past had followed her, patient and precise, just as she had once been in her own work. Around noon, she saw movement through the trees. Lucas and Ellie appeared on the shore, huddled under one rain-soaked blanket. She lowered the bridge for them, and they crossed quickly, their shoes squelching on the planks. "You shouldn't be out in weather like this," she said, though the relief in her voice softened the scold. Lucas shook his head, droplets flying from his hair. "We heard the trucks again last night," he said. "Down by the old logging road, same kind as before. I saw the sign on the side, Norchem." Maggie felt her stomach drop. "You're sure?" "Yeah. They were unloading barrels near the creek," he said. "Ellie saw it too." The girl nodded, her eyes wide. "They had masks," she whispered, "and lights. The water smelled funny." Maggie pressed her hand to her forehead. So it was true. The company hadn't stopped. They had only changed locations, burying their waste deeper in the forest, letting it bleed into the veins of the watershed. She had fought this once before and lost everything. But this time, the evidence was right in front of her, seeping into the lake she called home. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We have to document it," she said. "Photographs, samples, notes, everything." The children watched her with a mix of excitement and fear. "Will it be dangerous?" Ellie asked quietly. Maggie looked at her small, serious face and said the only thing that mattered. "Yes, but not as dangerous as doing nothing." That night, the air was thick with tension. The sky cleared just enough to reveal a full moon hanging low over the trees, turning the surface of the lake into a pale mirror. Maggie packed her old field bag with jars, a small camera, and the flashlight she had repaired after it went missing weeks ago. Lucas carried a notebook and a coil of string. Ellie insisted on bringing her drawings, saying they might help people understand what they had seen. Maggie didn't have the heart to argue. They crossed the bridge in silence, the wood groaning softly beneath their weight, and entered the forest, where the air smelled of wet leaves and oil. They followed the narrow trail along the creek, the sound of trickling water guiding them. After nearly half an hour, they saw it. A clearing carved into the trees, the ground gouged by tire tracks, and in the center, 4 metal barrels, dented and streaked with rust, their lids half open. A chemical odor hung in the air, strong enough to sting the eyes. Maggie crouched, pulling a jar from her bag, and filled it with the thin stream that ran past the barrels. Under the moonlight, the water shimmered faintly green. "Take pictures," she whispered. Lucas nodded and began snapping photos, his hands trembling slightly. Suddenly, the hum of an engine broke the stillness. Headlights flared through the trees, and the 3 of them froze. A truck was coming down the path, its tires grinding against the wet earth. Maggie grabbed the children's hands and pulled them behind a fallen log. The truck rolled into the clearing and stopped beside the barrels. 2 men stepped out, their faces shadowed by caps. One of them kicked a barrel lazily and laughed. "We'll finish this batch tomorrow," he said. "The old lady on the lake won't know a thing." Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. She waited until the men climbed back into the truck and drove away before letting herself breathe again. Lucas whispered, "They were talking about you." Maggie nodded. "I know." She gathered the jars and notebook quickly. "We have enough for now. We need to get back." They returned to the cabin just before dawn. The air was cold, their clothes damp, but the adrenaline kept them moving. Maggie locked the samples in a small chest under the floorboards and told the children to rest. But sleep was impossible. Every sound outside made her flinch, the rustle of branches, the creak of the stilts. She felt exposed, as though the forest itself knew what they had done. By midday, her worst fear came true. She was cataloging the samples when she heard the distant growl of an engine again, this time closer. A dark boat emerged from the fog, cutting across the lake toward her cabin. 2 men sat inside, one steering, the other holding what looked like a crowbar. Her hands went cold. "Lucas, Ellie," she whispered. "Under the floor. Now." The children obeyed without a word, sliding into the crawl space where the wooden planks lifted loose. Maggie pulled the lever on the bridge, raising it just as the boat reached the stilts. The men shouted, demanding she open the door. When she didn't answer, one of them fired a warning shot into the air. The sound shattered the quiet, echoing across the water. Maggie's heart pounded so loudly she thought they might hear it. "We know what you're doing," one man yelled. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." The boat circled once, the engine revving, then sped off into the mist. She stood frozen, staring at the ripples spreading across the lake, the gunshot still ringing in her ears. When she finally opened the hatch to the crawl space, Lucas climbed out, his face pale but determined. "They know," he said. Maggie nodded, unable to speak. Ellie clung to her leg, silent tears streaking her cheeks. Maggie knelt and held them both. "We'll be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. That evening, Lucas made a decision she didn't expect. "We should tell someone," he said. "A reporter. Or the police." Maggie shook her head. "The company has friends in both. They'll bury it again." He hesitated. "What if we don't tell them who we are? What if we send the proof without names?" She looked at him, seeing not a frightened boy, but the beginning of the man he might become. Brave, clear-eyed, unwilling to look away. "You think you can do that?" she asked. "I can try," he said. While Maggie rechecked the data, Lucas borrowed her laptop and, using a weak signal from the nearest cell tower, sent an anonymous email to a local journalist known for exposing corruption. He attached the photos, the notes, and a brief message. "Evidence of illegal dumping in protected wetlands near Miller's Lake. Norchem Industries responsible. Samples collected by witness." He hesitated before adding one last line. "The lake is dying. Please help." Then he pressed send. The following days were a blur of waiting. Maggie tried to maintain their routines, but the world felt charged with unease. She could sense the lake's distress, the fish moving sluggishly near the surface, the reeds turning brittle. Ellie grew quieter, sketching the same image again and again, the cabin surrounded by rising water. Maggie didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. On the fourth morning, a car appeared on the opposite shore. A man stepped out, waving a handkerchief as if signaling peace. "Miss Hart," he called. "My name is Daniel Ruiz. I'm with the Portland Gazette. I got your message." Maggie lowered the bridge cautiously, her heart pounding. The man crossed, careful not to look down at the water. He introduced himself, his voice low but urgent. "I didn't believe it at first," he said, "until I saw the documents. This is big." For hours they talked. Maggie showed him the samples, the reports, the photos. Ruiz recorded everything, his face tightening as the story unfolded. "They've been covering this up for years," he said. "You could have walked away, but you didn't." "Why?" Maggie glanced at the children playing quietly by the window. "Because someone has to care about what can't speak," she said simply. The article appeared 3 days later. It spread faster than Maggie imagined, picked up by national outlets, shared across networks she hadn't touched in years. The authorities arrived soon after, boats and trucks filling the narrow dirt road. Inspectors in hazmat suits took samples from the creek and confirmed what she already knew. The contamination was real, extensive, and deliberate. Norchem Industries denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. The dumping site became a scene of investigation, and the lake was declared an environmental disaster zone. Maggie watched from her porch as officials erected warning signs along the shore. Lucas and Ellie stood beside her, their small hands gripping the railing. "What happens now?" Ellie asked. Maggie looked out at the water, still and shimmering under the late afternoon sun. "Now," she said softly, "we heal it." Weeks passed. The reporters left, the officials withdrew, and the lake began its slow recovery. The water cleared little by little, the smell fading with each rainfall. Maggie stayed, overseeing the cleanup, guiding volunteers who came to learn how to monitor water quality. She turned the cabin into a small research outpost, filling its shelves with books and instruments. Lucas built a new bridge, stronger and wider, while Ellie painted signs that read, "Keep the water alive." Sometimes, when the wind blew right, Maggie could still catch the faint echo of that gunshot, but it no longer filled her with fear. It was part of the story now, like the creak of the stilts or the call of the heron that had returned to the reeds. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, she sat on the porch with her notebook. The pages were full again, of data, of sketches, of words that mattered. Lucas and Ellie played near the water, their laughter carrying across the lake. The bridge lay open, connecting the cabin to the shore as it hadn't been in months. Maggie dipped her pen and wrote the final entry. The water remembers. It remembers the poison. Yes, but also the hands that tried to mend it. Healing is slow, but it begins with witness. She closed the book and looked at the children, her heart swelling with something close to peace. As twilight deepened, the lake mirrored the sky, one vast sheet of quiet silver. The world was still, listening. And Maggie Hart, once a silenced, now part of that listening, felt the weight of solitude lift at last. The house above the quiet water had become something new, something living, a place not of hiding, but of return. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video, share this one with your friends, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.